$20 million. That is how much Charles Ponzi collected from ordinary working people in just 8 months. And every single cent of it was built on nothing but a piece of paper the size of a postcard. This is the autopsy of the original scheme, the one that put his name in the dictionary. In 1920, Charles Ponzi was a nobody. He was an Italian immigrant who had already done 2 stretches in prison, one in Canada for check forgery, one in Atlanta for smuggling illegal aliens across the border. He had failed at almost every hustle he had ever tried. He was 40 years old, broke, and living in Boston with his wife Rose. Then he noticed something. While opening his mail one afternoon, he found a small slip of paper tucked inside a letter from a Spanish correspondent. It was called an International Reply Coupon, an IRC. These were postal coupons that a person in one country could send to someone in another, so the recipient could use it to buy a return postage stamp. Simple enough. But here is where Ponzi's eye caught something that most people would have walked right past. Because of wild currency fluctuations after the First World War, you could buy one of these coupons in Spain for the equivalent of 1 American cent, then redeem it in the United States for 6 cents worth of postage. Buy low in Europe, cash out high in America. On paper, that is a 600% return on investment. On paper, Ponzi went to investors in Boston and made them a proposition they could not believe. Give me your money for 90 days, and I will double it. Or give it to me for 45 days, and I will return 50% profit. Where most savings accounts at the time were paying around 5% annually, Ponzi was promising 50% in 6 weeks. He launched a company called the Securities Exchange Company, a name designed to sound official, governmental, almost boring. And people lined up. The first investors were friends, neighbors, a few small businessmen. When they got their 50% back right on schedule, they did not cash out. They reinvested. And they told everyone they knew. By the spring of 1920, Ponzi was taking in hundreds of thousands of dollars a week. By summer, it was millions. Mail carriers later recalled that the daily flow of envelopes to his office on School Street was so dense it looked like a blizzard. At his peak, Ponzi was collecting more than $200,000 on a single day. People mortgaged their homes. Widows handed over their life savings. Police officers, priests, and city clerks all bought in. The Boston papers called him the financial wizard of the North End. He moved into a mansion in Lexington, Massachusetts. He bought his mother a first-class steamship ticket from Italy. He wore silk suits and carried a cane. Crowds gathered on the sidewalk outside his office just to catch a glimpse of the man who was making Boston rich. But here is what Charles Ponzi was not doing. He was not buying a single international reply coupon. Not one. Investigators would later determine that the entire global supply of IRCs in circulation at the time was nowhere near large enough to account for the volume of trades Ponzi would have needed to generate his promised returns. The logistics alone were impossible. You cannot physically redeem millions of postal coupons fast enough to run an operation this size. The arbitrage was real in theory. It was a fiction in practice. What Ponzi was actually doing was something far simpler and far more destructive. He was paying old investors with money from new investors. That is it. That is the entire machine. The moment new money stopped flowing in, the whole structure would collapse under its own weight. And in the summer of 1920, the money did stop flowing. On July 26th, the Boston Post published a front-page story questioning Ponzi's math. A financial analyst named Clarence Barron, the same man whose name sits on Barron's financial magazine to this day, pointed out publicly that for Ponzi's operation to be legitimate, Roughly 160 million IRCs would need to be in circulation worldwide. The actual number was around 27,000. The next morning, investors began showing up at Ponzi's office demanding their money back. Ponzi did something almost no one expected. He kept paying. For days, he stood at the counter himself, handing out cash, joking with the crowd, acting as if the whole thing was a misunderstanding. He paid out nearly $2 million in a single week to nervous investors, and the papers began to swing back in his favor. Some investors who had come to withdraw actually reinvested after seeing how calm he was. But the Massachusetts banking commissioner had already ordered an audit. And on August 2, 1920, a man named William McMasters, a publicist Ponzi himself had hired, went back to the Boston Post and told them everything he had seen inside the books. The story ran on August 11th. It was over in hours. The bank that held most of Ponzi's accounts, Hanover Trust, a bank he had actually taken control of himself by buying a controlling stake with investor money, was declared insolvent. Federal and state investigators swarmed his office. Ponzi surrendered on August 12, 1920. He was 40 years old. He owed investors somewhere between $7 million and $20 million, depending on the accounting method, because his own books were a catastrophe. He pleaded guilty to a single count of mail fraud in federal court. He was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. But the story did not end there. After his federal sentence, Massachusetts indicted him on state charges. He fought it, briefly jumped bail, was caught in Florida while allegedly attempting to run a fraudulent land scheme, was returned to Massachusetts, was convicted again, and eventually served an additional 7 years. He was deported to Italy in 1934. He died in Rio de Janeiro in 1949, nearly penniless, reportedly with only $75 to his name at the time of his death. The man who had handled $20 million left the earth with 75. Most of his investors recovered somewhere between 30 cents and less than $1 for every dollar they had trusted him with. The lesson the money autopsy takes from Charles Ponzi is not complicated. It is this: the return never comes from where you are told it comes from. In every scheme that follows the shape of what Ponzi built, the mechanism is always described as something exotic, something technical, something that sounds just plausible enough that asking too many questions feels embarrassing. The postal coupon, the algorithm, the offshore arbitrage, the guaranteed yield. What the money is actually doing is flowing in a circle, from the person who just arrived to the person who arrived before them, until the circle breaks. And the circle always breaks, because the only way to keep it alive is to keep it growing. And nothing grows forever. When the music stops, the people closest to the exit walk away. Everyone else holds paper.